Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our study of ministry to God through continual worship and prayer. Now, as we dive deeper into the biblical definitions and examples and instructions regarding ministry to God, it's important for us to set a framework for how we're going to study the scripture together. Now, the topic of ministry to God is not very commonly taught, and this puts us at somewhat of a disadvantage because we're less familiar with the language, with the principles and the passages of Scripture and the biblical instruction. It's not something that we all grew up with in Sunday school or that we've all seen clearly demonstrated in our modern church context. But as this study will demonstrate, the topic of ministry to God is integral and preeminent to the destiny of the people of God. It's necessary for us to form a historical framework by which we can comprehend the biblical intention and expectation of ministry to God in our day and time to substantiate our understanding. So we need to push through. It's important that we push through our unfamiliarity and not allow ourselves to be restrained from pursuing the fullest understanding of Scripture's intent for ministry to God. We can't judge something as important or unimportant because we did not grow up familiar with it or because we have not heard it commonly taught. We cannot judge the truth of Scripture based on if it lines up with our current culture. We actually need to conform our culture to what Scripture says is directly applicable to us today. That's my approach. Our loyalty cannot be so blindly given to dim reflections of inherited ministry models, but to the blindingly vibrant instruction of Scripture itself, which is itself our plumb line. Through diligent study, prayer, and fasting, and dialogue with the Spirit of truth, we will begin to experience the water's edge of the infinite ocean that is the divine destiny of the people of God, expressed in ministry to God, specifically through continual worship and prayer. Our other disadvantage is understanding the different cultural context between how we as Americans read Scripture and how an ancient Hebrew would have received this instruction from God. As Americans, we have more of a Greek mindset where we study Scripture with more of an intellectual, philosophical, theoretical approach that's far more objective and impersonal. But in ancient Hebrew, would have been far more personal, relational, practical, functional, and tactile. As Americans, we can spend all day giving intellectual assent to the idea of God's love. But a Hebrew would have understood that that revelation of God put a demand on their life and that the instruction was something they were called to fulfill. They understood that the knowledge of God was not just a concept, but it was a calling. And sometimes we forget that in our approach to Scripture. We need to remember this as we continue to study ministry to God. This is not just an intellectual exercise because ministry to God is very practical and relational in nature. Now, if you have any questions or comments about what we've talked about today, I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch or listen to this, and we're going to jump right into the Scripture next week.